Winter storms in Alaska aren't unusual. Most of us know how to handle them, even the fierce ones. I'd lived alone in my house for 5 years, a modest place on the edge of the woods. It's far enough from the city to feel quiet, but close enough for a manageable commute. That night, though, the storm hit harder than usual. It was a Friday in December 2017, and I closed the store early, sending my staff home before the roads got too bad. By the time I got back, the snow was falling thick, turning my driveway into a white mess. After shoveling just enough to park, I went inside, locked up, and turned on the heater. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows occasionally, but I found the sound comforting. I made a mug of cocoa and settled into my worn recliner. The evening was shaping up just how I liked it. No noise, no people, just me and the storm. Around midnight, halfway through a random documentary on glaciers, I heard a knock. I hit pause and sat up straighter. I live pretty far out, and my nearest neighbor is at least a quarter mile down the road. Visitors at midnight aren't common. I pulled the curtain aside and peeked out the front window. Snow blurred the porch light, but there was no one there, just swirling flurries. Then I saw the boot prints. They led right up to my door and back down the steps. Fresh tracks, sharp-edged, with no snow filling them in yet. Opening the door wasn't an option. The wind would have blasted snow into the entryway, and something about the prints unsettled me. I stood there for a moment, hand hovering over the deadbolt, listening. Nothing but the wind. After a minute, I locked the door again and returned to my recliner, trying to brush it off. Maybe someone got lost or was a random hiker. But deep down I felt uneasy. An hour later, the second knock came. This time it wasn't at the front door. It came from the side of the house, near the kitchen window. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by the door, my pulse quickening. The kitchen window was completely frosted over, so I couldn't see much. I flicked off the lights inside and aimed the flashlight outside. Nothing. The snow outside was untouched, no footprints, no signs of movement, but the knock had been real. I stayed there, flashlight in hand, scanning the yard. A few minutes passed, and I convinced myself it was just a tree branch or the storm playing tricks. I turned the lights back on, locked the windows, and went to bed, leaving the flashlight on the nightstand. I woke to the third knock. This one was louder, coming from the back of the house near the sliding glass door. My heart sank as I sat up, straining to hear over the wind. I grabbed the flashlight and crept down the hallway. The sliding door was locked, but the curtain wasn't drawn. I paused, peering out. The deck was empty. The snow-covered deck was undisturbed, but the knocks had been real. 3 sharp raps as clear as day. I stayed there for a while, staring into the swirling snow. The only thing visible was the faint outline of the woods beyond the yard. The rest of the night was worse. The knocks didn't stop. They came every hour, sometimes louder, sometimes softer. Front door, side windows, back door. They moved around the house like someone was circling it. At one point, I thought I heard faint footsteps crunching through the snow. But when I looked out, there was nothing. The storm was too strong to go outside. Even if I could, what was I supposed to do? Chase invisible knocks in a blizzard? I spent the rest of the night on edge, flashlight in hand, every light in the house on. By morning, the storm had eased. The wind had died down, and pale sunlight filtered through the overcast sky. I stepped outside cautiously, bundled in my thick coat and boots. The yard was quiet, the snow deep but undisturbed. But as I walked around the house, I noticed the footprints. They weren't just at the front door or the deck. They were everywhere. Boot prints circled the house, weaving between the windows and doors. Whoever made them had walked the perimeter several times, stopping at every entrance, every pane of glass. When I reached the edge of the woods, I noticed something else. The footprints continued deep into the forest, weaving between trees. I decided to follow them. About 200 yards in, the footprints changed. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw them merge with something else, tire tracks. The faint imprint of a snowmobile had flattened the snow. The path curved off into the distance. I crouched down to look closer. The tracks weren't fresh, a thin layer of snow covered them. Whoever it was had planned this. They left just before daylight, knowing the snowfall would cover their escape. I stood there for a while, debating whether to go further, but the snowmobile's trail was faint, barely visible. and I wasn't equipped to trek through the woods for miles. Back at the house, I called the police. 2 officers arrived about an hour later, one young, one older. They listened as I explained what had happened, their expressions shifting from skeptical to serious when I mentioned the snowmobile tracks. The younger officer raised an eyebrow. "Could be kids messing around," he said. The older officer shook his head. "Not a lot of kids riding through blizzards at night," he said, giving the younger officer a look. They followed the tracks into the woods, but returned within 15 minutes. The snow had almost filled them in by then, too faint to follow. "This wasn't random," the older officer said. "Whoever it was, they knew exactly what they were doing." A lump formed in my throat. What do you think they wanted? Hard to say. Could have been someone looking for shelter. Or maybe they just wanted to scare you. That word didn't even begin to cover it. After the officers left, the unease settled over me like the heavy snow outside. I couldn't stop picturing the footprints circling my house and the snowmobile waiting like a getaway vehicle. This wasn't a harmless prank. Whoever it was had planned it, stalking around my home during the storm, knowing I wouldn't venture outside. By mid-afternoon, I knew I wouldn't make it through another night without doing something more. I grabbed my jacket and headed into town. The nearest gun store was about 20 miles away. The drive felt surreal, like I was stepping into someone else's life. I'd never been into firearms, but after the previous night, the thought of being unarmed if someone came back wasn't something I could live with. I left the store with a 9mm handgun, a hunting rifle, and enough ammunition to feel like I had a fighting chance if things escalated. The clerk threw in a quick lesson on proper handling and storage. His parting words stuck with me more than anything else. Don't go looking for trouble, but make sure you're ready if it finds you. That night marked a turning point. From then on, the handgun stayed on the nightstand, within easy reach, and the rifle remained propped by the front door, ready for anything. I'd always loved living out in the woods, the solitude, the quiet, the sense of freedom. I wasn't about to let some creep take that away from me. Sure, I was rattled. Who wouldn't be? But I'm not the kind of person to back down. If someone tried pulling something like that again, they'd get a much different reception than a house shrouded in darkness. I refused to let fear take over. This was my home, my slice of quiet in an otherwise chaotic world, and I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel like a prisoner in my own space. I'd always loved the stillness of winter storms, the way the snow blanketed everything and made the woods feel like a different world. Now, I saw the storms differently. They weren't just peaceful, they were a cover, a shield for anyone lurking just beyond the tree line. But instead of retreating, I made a choice. If anyone wanted to come back and test their luck, I'd be ready to welcome them. This time on my terms. Because out here, in the quiet of the woods, you either learn to protect what's yours, or you let someone else take it from you. And I wasn't about to let that happen. I still don't know who they were or what they wanted. Maybe it was a prank, maybe it was something worse. But every time the snow starts falling and the wind howls through the woods, I find myself checking the locks, looking at the rifle by the door and wondering if they'll come back. And if they do, this time I'll be ready. It was a cold November evening, and I was in 7th grade. My parents had recently started trusting me to stay home alone while they went out. At that age, it felt like a big step toward independence. My go-to activity during these nights was playing video games in the basement. The basement in my parents' house was large, with a low ceiling and dim lighting that gave it an eerie vibe. As kids, my brother and I were terrified of being down there alone. We'd race up the stairs, convinced something was chasing us. By the time I was 12, I wasn't scared like I used to be, but I still caught myself glancing over my shoulder sometimes, especially when I was alone. That evening, I was immersed in some video game, headphones on, when a loud bang rattled the basement window. I froze mid-action, my heart thudding in my chest. I pulled off my headphones and spun around to look at the window. Snowflakes stuck to the glass, making it hard to see outside. My first thought was that it must have been an icicle falling from the roof. I took a deep breath, convincing myself there was nothing to worry about, and went back to my game. But before I could settle back in, there was another bang, this one louder. I stood up this time, moving closer to the window. More snow had gathered on the glass, and it became clear that someone was throwing snowballs. My first thought? It had to be my older brother, Keith. Maybe he'd come home early to mess with me. Smiling at the idea, I headed upstairs and opened the back door. The cold air hit me immediately, and snow crunched under my slides as I stepped out into the yard. The backyard was partially blocked by a tall brick wall, so I moved past it to get a better view. "Keith," I called out, "why didn't you tell me you were coming home?" I spotted movement near the bushes by the back fence. Someone was crouching there, clearly trying to hide. "Keith, I can see you," I said, laughing nervously. But as I stared at the figure, something felt off. They didn't move or respond, and the longer I looked, the more uneasy I became. I quickly stepped back into the house, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I picked up the phone and called my mom. "Hey, is Keith supposed to be home tonight?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "No," she said. "He's staying at his friend's house, remember?" That's when I panicked. "There's someone in the backyard," I whispered. My mom immediately put me on speaker so my dad could join the call. He tried to reassure me, suggesting it might just be some kids messing around. But then another snowball hit the kitchen window, loud enough for my parents to hear over the phone. My mom told me to lock myself in my room, turn off the lights, and wait. She promised to call the police. I didn't waste a second. I ran upstairs, bolted the door, and sat in the dark, peeking out through a crack in the blinds. From my window, I could see the figure moving around the backyard, pacing near the downstairs windows. At one point, they tried lifting one of the windows, but it was locked, thankfully. Then they stepped back, looking up toward the second floor. I ducked down, my heart pounding. Moments later, a thud against my bedroom window made me jump. I peeked out and saw them standing below, throwing snowballs directly at my window. I could barely make out their face under the hood of a coat, but they were tall, not a kid. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the snowballs stopped. The figure disappeared into the shadows. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police. Finally, the doorbell rang. I crept downstairs and peeked through the peephole, relieved to see a female officer standing on the porch. I let her in, and she did a sweep of the property with her flashlight while I stayed inside, watching her through the windows. When she came back, she told me there were footprints all over the yard, but whoever it was had already left. She stayed with me until my parents got home. Looking back, I'm not sure what to make of it. Was it just some twisted prank, or was it something more serious? The way they tried to open the window makes me think it wasn't just for fun. Either way, I'll never forget how vulnerable I felt that night. It taught me how quickly a seemingly normal evening could turn into something terrifying. Last winter afternoon, my friends and I decided to make the most of the snowstorm that had rolled in overnight. We grabbed our sleds and snowboards and headed to the massive golf course just down the street. It was a place we'd been to countless times before, a sprawling stretch of rolling hills perfect for sledding, tucked far from the main road. The day started beautifully. The sky was overcast, but the snow was falling lightly, giving the whole place a serene, wintry charm. We spent hours racing down the hills, laughing as we wiped out and trying to land tricks on our snowboards. The cold didn't bother us much then. We were having too much fun. But as the afternoon wore on, the light started to fade, and so did the calm weather. By the time we decided to pack up and head home, the light snow had transformed into something much fiercer. It happened so fast, like flipping a switch. One minute, the snow was gently dusting the ground, and the next, thick flakes were swirling violently around us. The wind picked up, stinging our faces and making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The storm seemed to erase the world around us. We figured the walk back would be simple. We knew the course well, or so we thought. But the snow was relentless, covering every trace of our earlier tracks and burying the familiar landmarks we usually relied on. The hills, trees, and open stretches of snow all blended into an endless white void. At first, we joked about it, saying we were just taking the scenic route, but as the sun dipped lower and the cold crept deeper into our bones, the laughter stopped. None of us could tell which direction would lead us back to the road. We kept moving, hoping to stumble across something familiar, but the snow only seemed to grow deeper with every step. Our phones were dead, and with the storm raging, we couldn't hear anything but the wind. It felt like we were walking in circles, each step more exhausting than the last. When the light finally disappeared, leaving us in pitch darkness, it hit us just how much trouble we were in. We'd been walking for what felt like hours, but the road was nowhere in sight. The storm showed no sign of letting up, and we had no choice but to stop and rest under a massive pine tree. Huddled under the branches, we debated our next move. Someone suggested we take a nap and wait for the storm to pass, but the idea filled me with dread. I'd heard too many stories of people freezing to death after falling asleep in the cold. We all knew we couldn't stay there for long. It was only getting colder, and the storm wasn't stopping anytime soon. We left the sleds behind to lighten our load and pushed on. The snow had piled up so high that walking felt like wading through waist-deep water. Every step took all the energy we had left. The wind cut through every layer of clothing, and my face was numb despite the scarf wrapped around it. At one point, I honestly started to wonder if we'd ever find our way out. The thought was terrifying, but I didn't have the energy to dwell on it. I just focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Then finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw it, a faint glow in the distance. Streetlights. At first, we thought our minds were playing tricks on us, but as we trudged closer, the lights grew brighter, cutting through the swirling snow. Reaching the road felt like a miracle. The plows had already been through, and the asphalt beneath the snow looked like a lifeline. We staggered the last few blocks to my friend Sarah's house, barely able to keep ourselves upright. When we stumbled inside, we were soaked to the bone, our clothes stiff and partially frozen. Sarah's mom took one look at us and sprang into action, wrapping us in blankets and building a roaring fire. The warmth was a blessing, but it was also painful as the feeling returned to our frozen hands and feet. That night, none of us spoke much. We just sat by the fire, exhausted, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot chocolate. One of my friends, Mark, ended up with mild frostbite on his toes, and Sarah's mom kept a close eye on him to make sure it didn't get worse. It wasn't until the next day that the full weight of what had happened hit me. The storm had raged on through the night and into the next afternoon. If we'd stayed under that tree and fallen asleep, we might not have made it out. It's almost funny to think that a golf course, a place we'd sledded on 100 times before, could feel so dangerous. But in that storm, everything we thought we knew was wiped away. The familiar hills and paths became an endless, featureless expanse of white. I sometimes wonder what our path looked like that night. Did we wander in circles? How close were we to the road before veering off in the wrong direction? We'll never know. What I do know is how easy it is to get caught off guard. One bad decision, one moment of hesitation, and everything can change. That night, we were lucky. Luckily, the storm wasn't worse. Lucky we didn't give up. Lucky we found our way out. But it's a memory that stays with me. Whenever I see snow falling thick and fast, I think back to that night and how close we came to real danger. It was a reminder of how powerful nature can be and how small we are in comparison.